My name is Cameron Knowler. I started playing music early, not acoustic music, and then around the age of 15, I discovered American traditional music and kind of went in through the bluegrass entryway and kind of came out on the older side of string band music. Since then, I've kind of specialized in writing and thinking about the interconnection between rhythm guitar players from the 20s and 30s and how that gave birth to melodic flat-picked guitar that would later be associated with bluegrass, and kind of how those lineages most often can be one and the same. What is the relationship between my practice as, say, an archivist and a historian, as well as like a recording artist? I always wanted to figure out a way of making a record that kind of had the self-contained aspects of, like a Windham Hill record or a John Fahey record, but with kind of some of the tightrope walking aspects of playing, flat-picked music. The area of history that I'm kind of most concerned with is before the era that my music kind of comes from. Of course, everything's kind of in there, but I think the harmonic language of my music is, more related to kind of what I would call like the neoclassical people, like Fahey or Bert Jansch or John Renbourn. The archivism and study of early music would be more related to the people in the 20s and 30s. I think for me, finding Norman Blake, he always talked about Mother Maybelle Carter. Through doing my book, Guitarists Have Feelings Too, I kind of connected the dots, or tried to connect the dots between Mother Maybelle Carter and Riley Puckett, and kind of reverse engineering some of what Norman was doing melodically and rhythmically. And so those sorts of folks, what I call kind of the cowboy guitar players to like Wilf Carter or Carl T. Sprague, a guy named Dick Justice. I think a lot of people don't realize the thing about Riley Puckett, you hear people like Gene Autry and Jimmy Rogers and their massive discographies. They were obviously playing the music of Puckett, and he, for me, connects a lot of the dots with the flat pickers as well as the cowboys and the fingerstyle players as well. What fascinates me about being a teacher and a writer and trying to make this stuff legible for people is the idea that improvisation itself doesn't have to necessarily be on a level of note choice, where it could just be a single note with complex rhythms. Oftentimes things that present kind of close to clave, like something called the Georgia clave, is something I analyze in Northwest Georgia music, and how it's a very specific way of playing in halftime, which I heard in Norman's playing. And for me, Riley Puckett kind of just exploded that door. So a lot of it presents as rhythm. I grew up on the border of California in Yuma, Arizona. I heard a steel guitar early on, but I wasn't playing country music. I was just kind of idly playing, rock style stuff on a Parker guitar. Had a great teacher named Aaron Holtstrand, and he would just kind of jump off any cliff with me, basically. I guess my dexterity sense applied to the instrument, but there was no real, serious study. From there, just learned about Norman Blake first, who ended up being my portal into basically everything that I do in a very central way. During the pandemic, I had done this book, Guitarists Have Feelings Too, which kind of reverse engineered his approach to playing, and sent him a book. He was very complimentary, and he invited me to come down, or I asked him if I can come down, and he very graciously, he and Nancy, his wife and wonderful musician Nancy Blake, had me down and got to connect a lot of dots and pick his brain about everything. And a couple of tunes finally couldn't learn from the record, but got him to sit down with me and show me them. That is how I got to know Norman. Norman's, learning guitar in the, late 40s and 50s, and starts kind of coming of age in the late 60s, and released his first solo record in the early 70s. I think for Norman, his contribution is kind of connecting two otherwise disjunct circuits in like a breaker to me. He showed the interconnection between flat-picked language and fingerstyle language. It's a cliche to say that he's, lumped with the flat pickers, but I think that's kind of his most ostensible contribution, was a sensitive, kind of light on its feet right hand, but it's very much related to, early country music, country blues, ballads, that sort of stuff. I was writing a book about Riley Puckett, finally discovered that he used a different tuning entirely, where he raised his low E up to G. Once I heard that, went back to all 200 transcriptions that I had done, I had to refigure everything with the raised bass. I mean, basically the G run as we know it, I would make an argument to say, not that he invented it per se, but that his, even in an idiomatic way, it's like the first instance of that I can hear. My kind of archival impulse, if you will, kind of runs parallel to what I do in terms of writing. And so I do a lot of work as a photo archivist at the Grand Ole Opry, as well as helping kind of manage and keep their instrument collection, which a large part of that is the Roy Acuff collection. And I feel very fortunate to have crossed paths with a lot of instruments that have these stories that are almost kind of meticulously hanging on to them just through little bits and bobs, something in a guitar case, a Hank Snow leather hand tool guitar case with, a rattlesnake rattle just laying in the lining and you pull it out, those sorts of things. What's so exciting about playing guitars without some strictly chiseled provenance is the fact that you can invent what they do and you can figure out what their use is. So old instruments like this one or some of the other ones I have is just, you take a look inside them and it's like, oh, wow, that's double X brace. I didn't really know that. And then you read a book about it and there's not really a consensus. So that conversation is up to us to continue and to forge ourselves. I didn't read music, but being homeschooled, I decided I wanted to study jazz guitar in school with a great professor in Houston where I was living at the time. If I would listen to somebody, I could recreate their sound, their timbre more so than what they were actually playing. That itself gave me the voice that I would later flesh out with those other skills. This is a very personal guitar in that I was making the move from Houston, Texas to Los Angeles, and I stopped at my favorite guitar store, Stay Gold Guitars, in Santa Fe, New Mexico. The consensus is still out as to whether or not it's fully laminated, back and sides, Brazilian rosewood, or just laminated rosewood. Some say solid sides, laminated back. That's kind of my guess. The sound hole is an interesting size and in an interesting position. Guitars of this era until later, I don't know exactly when, the 10th fret ended up becoming the 9th fret, so that kind of messes up people. This marker is at the 16th fret, which is kind of funny. Yeah, everything about it is basically original. Original tuners, which I put back on there, and they work fine as long as you're tuning up to the note. If I understand correctly, it is double X braced. One kind of anomalous thing about this guitar, which you see guitars like this, so basically the grand auditorium size is what I believe they were calling this size. It's technically supposed to be labeled 5234 as the model designation. And these Washburns are cool because if it's like 5234 and a half, it means it has a sunburst. So it's a very kind of industrial naming system. But this one's technically a 5234 because of the width of the lower bout, but it's branded 5238. So you kind of see some of those. And the serial number says basically that's a 1935, but if it were a 1935, it would probably have herringbone, and it probably would have been labeled a 5234. So it could have been a later neck with an earlier body, that sort of thing. Another thing that I love about Washburns is you look at Washburns from the 1890s and they did a bunch of like wacky stuff, like Lear guitars with like two sound channels going off this way with a golden baby's head over, connecting those two pieces together. You see design cues that are continuous from like 1890 to 1930. One of them being this really stylish, I think, volute and kind of the crown top that almost looks like a mountain range to me. I play the EJ16s that are lights, the phosphor bronze, like that's what I have on this guitar. I have an old Gibson J35 that Goes back and forth between nickel bronze and phosphor bronze. Those are the two main ones, but pure nickel I find works really well on select guitars, especially mahogany guitars. The pure nickel XLs I use on my Martin, the silk and steel strings on certain guitars that are tiny, that have a slot head, and I'm not trying to make a huge ruckus with. I think the middle of the road for me is just EJ16s. Increasingly more so would be nickel bronze. I just kind of hear guitars through nickel bronze, and that's the first thing I start with. And if it needs a little bit more pizzazz, specifically in the low end, I do an EJ16, and I know that's where it needs to be. First off, I feel that their tonal coloring isn't superfluous, and I can hear what it's coloring, if that makes sense. Kind of being back and forth, almost between like black and white in color, almost like a pure nickel just gives me, I know what the overtone and fundamental information of the guitar is, and I feel like they're very honest about what they do past that point. I remember for probably my 8th or 9th birthday, my older brother gave me a pair of Guns N' Roses branded drumsticks and a pair of XLs, like 9s for my Parker. And the iconography of that, I guess it was like orange or blue with the white circle or whatever. I guess, so that's what, 20 years? This guitar was a Chicago World's Fair guitar that Gibson launched. It's kind of an amalgam of a number of different models. The title is the LC Century of Progress guitar. I understand it to be laminated maple back and solid size, which is kind of similar to the other instrument I was talking about. Pearloid fingerboard, it's a very small veneer over I guess, a maple board. And I understand these kind of rosewood inlay blocks here to be from kind of recycled from old banjos. This guitar was purchased by the great John Arnold, a wonderful, just absolutely top tier builder and guitar thinker and a great player. He got this guitar, and apparently it was pretty worn down. He called it scruffy. I only learned this recently, that he called it scruffy because of the finish flaking off on the sides. He was going to take it to Norman. He was showing it at a guitar show in either North or South Carolina, and then headed up, I guess, to Georgia, where Norman is, Northwest Georgia. And Norman looked at it, and he's like, he said, I don't play furniture just because it's got a maple back and sides, but after playing it, fell in love with it. Yeah, on the saddle, you can tell where Norman, with his own files, intonated the guitar, so there's little channels cut, and almost like a typewriter or something. You can see where he pushed it over. He did it, didn't like it, and then pushed it over, so there's a little material there. Tons of playwear. The sides, hence its name, given by John Arnold as scruffy. You can see a lot of this stuff, some of this old finish flaking off, kind of insane spider web of cracking.